Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to raise and bring up and advance the eco-socialist program that we ran on. So first off, I want to wish everybody Happy New Year. And I hope you had a great holiday season and you're recharged and ready to go because we have our work cut out for us. What I want to do here in the first few minutes is just kind of outline where I think we're at as we go into 2022. I think at the top of the list is this democracy crisis. The Republicans are using their power in the states to entrench themselves in power with minority support. They're gerrymandering, they're passing voter suppression laws, and probably most ominous is that they're passing laws where they can control the election administration and certification so they can steal elections. And our constitutional system already has anti-majoritarian biases like the Electoral College and the US Senate, which give disproportionate power to what is now rural white conservative America. But they're enhancing that. So they want to rule from a minority position. Meanwhile, the Democrats are letting them get away with it. They have failed to lift the filibuster, at least for the voting rights and election protection bills, which means if they don't do that, they're just handing power back to the Republican Party. And the leadership of the Democratic Party, particularly Joe Biden, is still pursuing bipartisanship with a party that tried to overthrow his election. And how the extent to which they went to that is becoming more and more evident as new evidence comes out. And the Democrats are bringing cupcakes to a knife fight. So it's up to the Greens. We got to put forward a pro-democracy agenda, take leadership on that issue before the voters in the state. And we got to do that in legislative this year, 2022, in state legislative and congressional races. And what would that pro-democracy agenda be? Well, first of all, we got to demand filibuster reform and make that an issue that the Democrats can't hide from. But I think the most important thing we can push for, and we're winning at the local level on this, and potentially at the state level, is ranked choice voting, and particularly ranked choice voting for proportional representation. The single-member district winner-take-all system that we live under is exclusionary and anti-democratic because the plurality winner gets all the power, and the rest of us get no representation. So there is in Congress a Fair Representation Act that would set up proportional ranked choice voting for the House seats and ranked choice voting for Senate seats. But it only has a handful of endorsers. If you're one of those districts with a progressive so-called Democratic legislator, you need to put the pressure on them to get behind that bill and give it a higher profile. And now we know because this bill this article that I've mentioned before just came out in the Harvard Policy and Law Review. I don't have the link with me, but it's easy to find. It's the current volume. It has an article on how we can go to ranked choice national popular vote for president by congressional legislation. It won't require a constitutional amendment because there's sections in the Constitution that give Congress the power to regulate the presidential election. So on that basis, they've drafted a bill. It's in that article. And we need, that bill is nothing like that's been introduced. There is a bill for ranked choice voting, for a national popular vote for president, but not with ranked choice voting, which for us as Greens, we got to have in there. Otherwise, we're going to be called the spoilers every time we run. So that's crucial. And at the local and state level, we have been winning ranked choice voting. We need to extend that to proportional representation using ranked choice voting for multi-member districts for legislative bodies. These are reforms we can win. We got to give them a higher profile and really make them a national issue in this pro-democracy fight, because the remedies being put forward by the Democrats don't deal with what's hurting and basically eliminating the left from a serious role in electoral politics. And that is the single-member district winner-take-all system, plurality winner for president and other executive offices, and the issue of gerrymandering. Proportional representation, ranked choice voting from multi-member districts eliminates the problem of gerrymandering. So there are a lot of reasons, but a book just came out by a former publisher of the Progressive magazine on electoral reforms for Wisconsin. I just got it. I haven't read the whole thing, but he doesn't deal with proportional representation. In fact, he says in the introduction, yeah, it's a good reform, but I'm not going to talk about it. But that should be at the top of our agenda. And then the other thing that has been mentioned, the report just came back to President Biden about Supreme Court reform, but I don't see how they're going to move on it. I mean, the Supreme Court, as we know, gutted the Voting Rights Act. They eliminated pre-clearance of changes if they were racially biased back in 2013. And then this year in July, they said the racial impact of election changes don't matter if the law is written in a race-neutral way, which is what Jim Crow did. The literacy tests and the poll taxes, they applied to poor whites too, and a lot of them lost their votes. So it wasn't racially written. And the Supreme Court said even if the impact is racially biased, we don't care. And they also said, go right ahead and gerrymander your districts for partisan impact, which is what the Republicans and the Democrats are doing. In fact, there's you go to Data for Progress, they have an article out saying that actually the Democrats are gerrymandering just as much as the Republicans. And in the end, it may be a wash because the Democrats control big populous states with lots of districts like New York and Illinois, California. And so it may not be, the gerrymandering may be not so much biased toward the Republicans, but it's certainly biased no matter who's doing it against the Greens because they're single member districts with winner take all. So Supreme Court reforms we can bring up. This was mentioned in the Biden report on the Supreme Court reform was term limits. They suggested 18 years, which would give each presidential term 2 appointments with 9 justices. There's an article in the New York Times today, op-ed, saying let's go with 12 years, which will give 3 appointments. You can debate about that, but term limits would certainly end the practice of appointing young ideologues to be there for decades. The Congress has the power to strip jurisdiction from the Supreme Court. It's right there in the Constitution in certain areas, which obvious ones would be voting rights and abortion rights. One of the suggestions is adding justices as an immediate remedy to what we got now. That sounds good, but it could set off a cycle of Democrats and Republicans, depending on who's in power, just adding justices to get their people in. And you could end up with an unwieldy Supreme Court, because that's what happened in India. They have 30 justices. So my computer just did that. Okay. And then another idea is, Bernie Sanders actually suggested this, that you could rotate justices between the appeals and the Supreme Court, which would moderate the ideological right-wing bias of the current Supreme Court. And, he argues with, some lawyers backing him that that is possible. But in any case, reforming the Supreme Court has got to be part of the democracy reform agenda, because right now the Supreme Court is writing laws. They're going to do that with the abortion cases. They're just going to wipe out the existing case law in Roe v. Wade and write their own law based on what Mississippi has done to take away abortion rights. So that, I think, is top priority, because without that, without democracy, we're going to have a hard time dealing with the other issues. Top of which has to be the climate crisis. And Biden's out there permitting more oil and gas drilling and pipelines than Trump did, while talking about taking climate action. But Build Back Better, going back to his original American Jobs Plan, was never sufficient, and now, of course, has been diluted. And if you go through the different sectors of greenhouse gas emissions, mostly people talk about the power sector, generation of electricity. And right now, that's 27% of our greenhouse gas emissions. And there was in the original Build Back Better a clean energy standard. If a utility doesn't reduce its carbon emissions 4% per year, they would have got penalized. Now, 4% per year is pretty slow. That's 25 years to get to zero. and it didn't even reach Biden's stated goal, which he has no plan to really do, of getting to zero emissions by 2035 in the power sector. So all that's in there now is subsidies for renewables and no penalties for fossils, which means we're going to probably, if this goes forward, have what we've had over the last decade. Renewable generation has increased, but fossil fuel generation has not decreased. The emissions have decreased slightly because we've gone from coal to gas, but that only counts what's coming out of the smokestack, not all the methane emissions that natural gas emits from the wellhead, the pipelines, to the power plant. And there's studies showing that actually there's more greenhouse impact, global warming impact from gas than coal because of those methane emissions through the whole life cycle of natural gas. So even in the power sector, which they talk about, there is just not a program. The biggest sector is transportation. That's 29% of greenhouse gas emissions. So Build Back Better, if it does go through, has subsidies, particularly for electric vehicles, some for railroads. But there's no policy of trying to substitute more railroads, rail transportation for freight and people moving for personal vehicles and trucking. And that is what we need, not only to reduce carbon emissions, but to economize on the use of resources. Because as we make the transition to a renewable energy system, there's a strain on getting the rare earth metals as well as the other metals like copper that are needed for a 100% renewable energy system. So we need to economize on those mineral resources as well. In manufacturing, that's 23% of greenhouse gas emissions. And there's nothing really in the Build Back Better plan to transform high carbon industries like cement, steel, and chemicals, and producing those products without emitting carbon. There are ways to do that, but they have no plans to do that. And in buildings, that's 13% of emissions. And there are some token subsidies for retrofits, but at the rate they're proposing to do it, it'll take over a century. It's just not a serious program. And then agriculture is 10%, and there's nothing substantial there. In fact, they're actually trying to promote so-called biogas, which, like ethanol, actually increases the greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need to be raising as Greens is a global eco-socialist Green New Deal for 100% clean energy and zero emissions in a decade, moving toward negative emissions, because we're already over the safety threshold of 350 parts per million carbon in the atmosphere. We're at about 420. So we got to draw carbon out of the atmosphere to get back to a safe zone. And that can only be done on the timeline of a decade by public enterprise through the public sector in the power, transportation, and manufacturing sectors, so we can plan and coordinate the implementation of this rapid transition. And it's got to be global in scope, because increasingly emissions are coming from the newly industrialized countries, China, Indonesia, Vietnam, South Africa, Brazil. And if they don't stop emitting carbon on a fast timeline, we could do everything perfect in this country and the climate would still boil. So that's sometimes called climate reparations, where we invest in mitigating the loss and damage already from climate change and helping countries get to clean renewable energy systems. Sometimes called climate reparations, sometimes just climate finance. But they are really reparations, because we've been primarily responsible historically for carbon emissions and the exploitation of countries and destroying their biodiversity, like cutting down rainforests and putting in palm oil plantations, which reduces carbon sequestered in the biosphere, as well as kill off species and contribute to the instability of ecosystems. So these so-called reparations or climate finance is really an investment in the habitability of the planet for all of us. So that's a top priority. Another's got to be U.S. imperialism. It hasn't skipped a beat from Trump to Biden, except Biden is probably more effective imperialist, because the foreign powers viewed Trump as an ignorant incompetent whose word they just considered worthless. They didn't know what they were getting because he changed his mind overnight. Meanwhile, the one bipartisan thing we've got is a bloated military budget, $24 billion more than the Pentagon asked for. And that's not about defending the United States territory. That's about being profits for the military industrial corporations. And, they like wars and big military budgets because they make more money. And that is really driving a lot of this budget. That's why Congress gave the Pentagon more than they asked for, because military industrial corporations and the Pentagon put facilities in everybody's congressional district. So they all want to vote for it, get their little, pork barrel project for their own district. So we have a global military empire of over 800 foreign military bases. Though we don't have big troop deployments in any particular country fighting a war at this time, we have drone and special operations intervention in dozens of countries. And it's all about making them safe for exploitation by U.S. corporations. That's not in the interest of most of us. That's just in the interest of these big businesses. And then meanwhile, we got Cold War saber rattling and military exercises in the middle of a new, insane nuclear arms race, which the U.S. initiated with the modernization program under Obama, and the Russians and the Chinese are following suit at a fast pace, making the whole situation more unstable. And we talk human rights, but nobody takes us seriously. There's plenty to criticize in Russia and China, both of which arrested more people this week. China shut down another newspaper in Hong Kong, Myanmar, Saudi Arabia. I mean, there's plenty of countries that deserve criticism, but the U.S. doesn't have credibility when we've got rampant police brutality, mass incarceration, abuse of migrants that is hard to see the difference between Trump and Biden and what's going on at the border now, and the persecution of Julian Assange for publishing leaked documents, which is how the Washington Post and the New York Times report on the national security state and the national government generally every day. And if they convict Julian Assange for that, then investigative journalism, finding out what our government's really doing through leaks, is going to make journalists afraid to do that because they don't want to be prosecuted. So there are alternatives to that. We can be the world's humanitarian superpower and make friends instead of enemies. Example, free licensing of COVID vaccines. We put out a media release this week, and the link to it should go in the chat here. And what it's identified is many authorities that President Biden has now to make the Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson vaccines, basically freely license them around the world. He's got that authority under the Defense Production Act, under a couple provisions in patent law. And the World Trade Organization has a proposal. It's been there since October 2020 from India and South Africa to make to lift the patent, to waive the patents on these vaccines so they can be manufactured and distributed at cost around the world. And Biden has twice said he's for that, but then we got reporting early in December that in a meeting of the Intellectual Property Rights Council in the World Trade Organization, the U.S. did not support that proposal. So they say one thing, but their actions say another. So we got to be demanding that. There's actually a vaccine came out of Baylor and the Children's Hospital down there in Texas from Dr. Peter Hotez, I think his name is. He's been on cable. I've seen him on CNN and MSNBC. And they are freely licensing their vaccine, which just got approved in India. But they're asking the U.S. government to help with financing so it can be manufactured around the world. But no response from the federal government. So this COVID pandemic is one thing we can do, to get the vaccines, get the world vaccinated. None of us is safe till all of us is safe, because the more that virus circulates, the more mutants there are going to be, and they circulate in areas where vaccination rates are low. One of the facts we had in that release is that in the last year, 74% of vaccines went to the wealthy and upper middle income countries, and only 1% to the low income countries. So that's how we got Delta out of India and Omicron out of Africa. And this is going to continue until the world is vaccinated. The World Health Organization has been, shouting from the rooftops about that for 2 years now. And the U.S. has the power to respond, and it hasn't. In fact, it's basically fronting for big pharma who's making super profits. They're getting subsidized, and then they're using monopoly pricing, charging as much as 24 times what the production costs are of these vaccines. That's really criminal. And that's the way the U.S. could be a superpower, a humanitarian superpower in the world, instead of the military protector of big pharma and these other big businesses. And then, of course, the global Green New Deal. As I said, we provide money for mitigating the loss and damage from climate damage that has happened, as well as help countries get to 100% renewable energy systems. And that will make friends around the world and create jobs and economic development. So there's an alternative to the imperialism. And then, I'm going half an hour. I'm just going to summarize the economic Bill of Rights we are campaigning on. We still need Medicare for all, preferably as a national health service, especially in the midst of this pandemic. We need a guaranteed income above poverty. I'm not talking about Andrew Yang's universal basic income where everybody gets it. I'm talking about a minimum income built into the tax system. So if you're below the poverty line, the IRS will send you a check to get you above the poverty line every month. Guaranteed jobs. The Civilian Climate Corps, just to say a word about that, should be a public agency like the Civilian Conservation Corps was in the New Deal period in the 30s, where they developed the projects and then they hired the people as public employees. Instead, the Civilian Climate Corps is going to be farmed out to AmeriCorps. So AmeriCorps is going to, ask for grant proposals and then give out grants to private entities. Much more inefficient and less directed toward the climate action we need. And I could go on. I'd just say that, a couple things that this country doesn't have, which every other country except a few Pacific Islands, paid leave. And it should be through the Social Security system, not through private insurance like is proposed in Build Back Better, although that paid leave has probably been cut out. And the child tax credit, that's ending this month. It's been a big help for a lot of families. The proposal to keep it would have means testing and work requirements, which just makes it more expensive, creates conflicts between the poor and the people just above the means testing threshold. That's unnecessary, and it doesn't cost more to just give it to everybody and then recover it through progressive taxation. And I'll just say that's a whole nother thing we got to fight on, because right now working people are paying higher taxes than the super rich. And without elaborating on that, I suggest you get a hold of Emmanuel Say's and Gabriel Zuckman's book, The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. They document the fact that working people are paying more than the super rich. And then they have a lot of good proposals for progressive tax reform. So to wrap up, I think the New Year's message is that we need the Green Party more than ever. We need to be raising and running on these kinds of issues because no one else will. The GOP is seeking autocratic rule, and the Democrats are letting them do that. And the progressive Democrats are making the Democrats look better than they are. I mean, those that are really for these progressive reforms really ought to be in the Green Party. They never had the power in Congress. They overstated the power they had because the balance of power is with people, the conservative Democrats. Manchin is just the front man for a whole lot of conservative Democrats, corporate Democrats, from Nancy Pelosi to, Mark Warner in the Senate and Dianne Feinstein. Let's not kid ourselves. So we still don't have a good hand to deal with in Congress, but we can pressure them. And the best way to pressure them is not just be outside demonstrating, be outside and independent of them in the two capitalist party system of corporate rule and presenting an alternative. And we know from public opinion polls that majorities are with the Greens on issues like Medicare for all and the Green New Deal and taxing the rich. And that's why the Democrats try to keep us off the ballot, because they know our platform is more popular than theirs. So anyway, I think it's time for the Greens to really step up this year and mobilize this majority that's for the issues we're at and get Greens elected, or at least have serious campaigns that put these issues on the public agenda at every level, local, state, and Congress. So that's what I hope we can do this new year, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Michael Shin, as you pointed out before, the anti-slavery movement beat the two-party system. Are their strategies useful for the Green Party? Well, first of all, the Liberty Party in 1840 spoiled the election. They were the margin of difference in New York between the Whigs and the Democrats, and Democrats won. The Whigs were the lesser evil on the slavery question. But the Liberty Party went ahead and kept running. And that became eventually the Free Soil Party, then the Republican Party. And their strategy was to build from the bottom up. They were electing lots of local people, scores of state legislators, dozens of members of Congress. In fact, by the time Lincoln ran, he was not a third-party candidate when he was won in 1860. He's really the first-party candidate. The Republicans had the largest caucus of candidates in the Congress after the 1858 election. So I think that strategy of building from the bottom up. The Greens, we win local elections at a high rate. We need to go from hundreds to thousands. And on that basis, get in the state legislatures and the House. And once we have a caucus in the House, the whole discussion is going to change. And we can run a presidential candidate who will have to be covered. And it'll just change the whole dynamic. So, I think the basic point is build from below. And the other thing that the Liberty Party's Free Soil Party Republicans had is that the Whigs collapsed and divided over the slavery question. So this situation is different. The Republicans are so far right that they're a small minority. They get a bigger vote because there are a lot of country club Republicans that just like the tax cuts, don't really care about much else, and they'll tolerate, the racism and, misogyny and scapegoating toward other people. They just want their taxes lowered. But a lot of those people are kind of embarrassed by the Trumpite people. So there is an effort to build a centrist corporate party. The Serve America movement is probably the most prominent one. They got a lot of money. Maybe they can split the Republicans. And on the Democratic side, the contradictions between the real progressive Democrats and the corporate Democrats are pretty stark. Whether that will lead to a split, I don't know. I think what will lead to a split if the Greens start getting more and more votes, and allow those progressive Democrats to realize, hey, we can win with the Greens, and they may leave the Democratic Party. Certainly the voters. I think the politicians will be the last to go. But anyway, I think that's what we can learn from the one and only time in our history when a third party rose up and replaced one of the two major parties. That was eventually the Republican Party. And by the time they got power, they were corrupted, by the Gilded Age. The populists, the Greenback Labor Party and so forth were campaigning against the Republicans because big business had taken them over. William Neville, Socialist Party USA member here. Can you explain the state of the U.S. Postal Service? Postmaster DeJoy, I call him Postmaster No Joy, seems to want to privatize the U.S. Postal Service. Why is it important for socialists and the greater labor movement to support the U.S. Postal Service? It's really important. First of all, it's a public service, even though since Nixon they've tried to make it run like a corporation in the market. It has extra requirements on it, which are good, that UPS, FedEx, Amazon don't have. And that is they've got to provide service everywhere at an equal rate. So if you are a rural person, you get the same rate as an urban person. That's not true in these other services, which will charge you more to take it to more out-of-the-way places. And then it has handy infrastructure, post offices. And actually, the post office should be doing more. We need to bring back postal banking so the unbanked can go there and have savings and cash their checks without going to a predatory paycheck cashing place, and provide those kind of services that the private banking system does not. And this is important for ordinary people to have the ability to communicate with each other, with the healthcare system, with the government, with businesses, and it's important for the commercial sector to have a way to a level playing field to get their messages out and to deliver their packages. I mean, the Postal Service is like a yardstick because without it, the other big distributors, which are UPS and FedEx, and now more and more Amazon, they're oligopolies, and they will charge as much as the market will bear. And being just three major companies doing most of the deliveries, they will collude indirectly, if not directly, which would be illegal. Meanwhile, the post office's mandate is to operate at cost. They aren't supposed to operate at a profit, but provide the service at the lowest cost. And one thing, and this is something we need to push Congress to do, there is legislation back about, I guess it's 15 years ago now, the Republican Congress passed legislation to require the Postal Service to pre-fund their retiree health care system for 75 years. Nobody does that. I mean, they're funding the health care of people that haven't even been born yet. And that put a huge burden on the Postal Service budget, which they haven't been able to meet. I mean, that should be lifted, and they should, operate under the same actuary principles as other businesses or nonprofits or, government health insurance for retirees and so forth. So there's a lot to be done. Biden has appointed enough people to the Postal Service board that they could fire Postmaster No Joy. And all I want to ask is, what are they waiting for? And if Biden needs to give them a push, give them a push. Jay-Z, Howie, do you think distributing high-quality masks is a good plan for Greens to make gains in their communities? How can we make large impacts as the pandemic continues? I think that's a good idea. They are starting to get distributed. I know in New York, but I think people would appreciate that. That's the kind of thing you can do to, talk to people about, what the Greens are about and how can we make a large impacts as the pandemic continues. Well, I think we got to push for lifting the vaccine patents so the vaccine can be distributed worldwide. That's something we've got to push the federal government to do, and also make people in this country aware, because these unvaccinated regions of the world is where these new variants are going to come, and this thing is just going to continue cycling through new variants until we do that. I think we also got to push for supports. One way to help suppress the spread is to make the temporary health and safety standards that OSHA put in for the pandemic, which are now, I think they have been lifted, bring them back. That's personal protective equipment and arranging workspaces so there's social distancing and so forth. I mean, that's another area where we can push for changes that are needed. And the other thing is, Medicare for all, so that everybody has access to the medical system with no, so it's free at the point of service, paid for by, public funds through progressive taxation. And, part of the reason that vaccination rates were low for people of color and low income people was they don't have as close a connection to the healthcare system. And a lot of them weren't made aware for a while that the vaccines were free. And once they started getting out to pharmacies and so forth, the word did get out. So the vaccination rates are pretty similar by race and by income. And now the disparities between basically the Trumpy right, who are still resisting vaccinations, and the rest of us. So that is a tough thing to overcome. And I know it's been controversial for some, but I support the vaccine mandates because that's the only way you're going to get these people vaccinated that have been resisting. When they're subject to a mandate, over 99% of them do get vaccinated. And we've persuasion has only gone so far. And people decide that if they want to travel, or if they want to keep their job, or if they want to go to school, they'd rather do that and get vaccinated than be a hardhead and say I'm not going to get vaccinated. So I think that's another thing we need to support, because otherwise the unvaccinated, they're the ones more likely to be in the hospitals and die, which we all pay for through our insurance programs. And they also transmit the virus more than the vaccinated do. So there's a lot of things we can do. Michael Shin, my workplace is unionizing. By joining the organizing committee, would I learn or gain something that could advance Green Party interests? Or is it better spent solely focused on the Green Party? I wouldn't see that as either or, Michael. I would definitely get involved in the organizing committee. And if that organizing committee has the support of an established union, they have methods of organizing that will be useful in your Green Party organizing. So I think you'll learn a lot by being involved in that organizing committee. And so that's what I would recommend. And, when you're talking to your fellow workers, you can let them know you're in the Green Party, and that might lead to conversations or it might not. But I wouldn't push it aggressively. I'd just let everybody know that you're green. CWA, Communication Workers of America. Well, I think you're out in California. I know here in New York, they have good organizers. So I think they probably do there as well. Amelie, we have a serious homelessness crisis in LA. Yeah, you sure do. Regardless of all the money that's been raised, this issue is getting worse. What can be done at the local and state levels to successfully address this? Well, I think we need to start looking at public housing as a serious solution to the affordability crisis, which is at the root of homelessness. Some homeless people do have personal problems, addictions, and so forth, mental illness. It makes it hard for them without support to basically, be able to maintain a rental, place to live. And excuse me, let me just, how do I do this? Turn the phone off. Here we go. Sorry about that. So I was saying that, some people need help to just maintain a place to live, but most people are homeless because they don't have enough income to pay the high rents. In LA, the rent sure is too damn high. So we need to build a lot of public housing in order to bring down the market price, because public housing offered at cost rather than what the market will bear for profits sets a standard so that if there's enough public housing, people will go there if the private market isn't providing fair rents. And now what they did in Germany, Berlin, during the last election this fall, was they passed an advisory referendum to basically expropriate, take over what we call eminent domain, the big landlords in Berlin, to provide housing that's affordable in the public sector. I think we need to look at programs like that for places like Los Angeles. And then at the federal level, we need to change the policy that's been around since Nixon, where instead of expanding affordable housing by building public housing, they started subsidizing private developers. And that hasn't worked, obviously. And it's got worse and worse over the decades. So we got to go back to public housing. We just got to do it in a better way. What was done from the New Deal up until about 1970 was it was built originally for white working class people, but then after World War II, primarily people of color, and the projects were built in the worst parts of town, far from jobs and shopping and so forth. And it concentrated poverty among people of color. Um, and it was concentrated poverty. Public housing should be available, like it is in most European countries, to everybody who wants to live there. And the rents are scaled to your income. But then you've got, middle income, working class, and low income people living together. And that would reduce the segregation by class and particularly race that is so rampant in this country. So that would have that benefit. But basically, the homelessness issues got to be addressed in the short term. Rent control can put a cap on that and stop the problem from getting worse. But to build affordable housing, we got to do that through the public sector, which is what we did from the 30s until about 1970. It's what they do in Europe, and they don't have a homelessness problem. It's what we need to do. Vicky Corden. Obviously, the Electoral College hurts the Green Party and any other third parties. Yeah, it hurts the democracy. I mean, because of the Electoral College, we can get the loser of the popular vote elected president, like George W. Bush, like Donald Trump, and it biases, it gives greater weight to votes in the white conservative rural areas of this country. Originally, it was to give extra weight to the slave states. And as it's developed historically, it's also some of the southern states, but particularly mountain and Midwest and border states that are lower in population, but they get those extra 2 electoral votes because they get 2 senators. And that is just a bias in the whole system. And I think the average person, when you talk to them, of course, and a lot of people don't even know this isn't the way it is. Whoever wins the popular vote should be the president. So that's one thing, but we got to make it ranked choice, because then it really hurts the Green Party. If it's just a popular vote, we'll have the same problem we have with the Electoral College, in that the Green Party will be seen as splitting the center-left vote and enabling the right to win. Of course, the Libertarians on the right face the same thing. And you look at the numbers, and it looks like Jo Jorgensen, who didn't get that many votes, but she got enough in certain states that if her votes had gone for Trump, he would have won easily in those states. So some of the Republicans are scapegoating her. And we know what that's like, because we get blamed. Like, 2000, they say Nader, enabled Bush to win, ignoring the fact that the Supreme Court stopped the recount and anointed Bush president, and then said this decision should have no precedent going forward, but it has. And the fact is, the media went back and counted all the votes, using all the different standards that could have been used, dealing with hanging chads and so forth. And Gore won the state. Nader didn't cause the loss of the election. It was the Republicans stopping the recount and getting the Supreme Court to ratify that. But in any case, yeah, the Electoral College is an anachronism that hurts our democracy, hurts the Green Party, but it hurts all of us if we think that the most supported candidate for president should win. And so if we go to a national popular vote without ranked choice voting, a plurality can win. Like Clinton won with something like 44% of the vote in 92, because Ross Perot got a sizable vote. So yeah, we got it. The Electoral College should be a big issue. I remember when Hillary Clinton was first elected to the Senate here in 2000, right after that Bush versus Gore fiasco. And her first news conference was, I'm going to introduce legislation to get rid of the Electoral College. And that's the last we heard of it. She got the headline, and I think that's all she really cared about. So this is an issue you would think the Democrats, having lost, 2 elections by the Electoral College when they won the popular vote, would try to make it an issue, but they're not. That's why we need the Green Party. The memdroid, whatever that is. How can we get the Green Party to get more recognition than it does now? I think we need to elect more people, and we can do that at the local level. And once we're a presence in, the local city councils, town boards, school boards, and other offices, we're part of the discussion at the grassroots. And then as we run for state and congressional races, the grassroots, the people are going to say, yeah, the Green Party should be recognized, should be in the debates, are worth voting for if we agree with their policies. So I think it's, people say, well, how do we get more media coverage? I think the media is going to follow the people in this case, in the Green Party, and getting more people elected to the point where they cannot ignore us. So that's, I think, how we get more recognition. We got to be a bigger presence both in local electoral politics and also in the issues campaigns that are going on between elections. Greens should be very visible at, affordable housing, anti-police brutality, climate action, and other, demonstrations and public hearings and other, issue-oriented advocacy and campaigns. Waiting here for the next question. While I'm doing that, let's see if I can find something in the chat. Here we go. Jay-Z, I noticed that the Green Socialist Notes is accepting submissions. Are reviews for documentaries welcome, or should we focus on more substantive writing? I think reviews of documentaries is substantive, and I think the editors of Green Socialist Notes would certainly consider a submission on that. If people don't know, Green Socialist Notes is in the works by the Green Socialist Organizing Project. Right now, it's just online. It's occasional articles, but we hope to turn into a regular online publication that will have, pieces that people will want to read to stay up on, what's going on and what we need to do. So go to greensocialist.net to find out more information about that. Yeah, it's already up in the chat. Submit your piece to Green Socialist Notes at greensocialist.net. Eric Gray, what are your thoughts on the case Richard Wolff has made against vaccine mandates on the basis of class struggle? Yeah, I think Richard needs to get out and talk to the workers more. He made those statements on Jimmy Dore, who's, been going after this too. At a time when the mandates were just coming down and there were street protests against the mandates, but I think Richard confused what those demonstrations were, which were spearheaded by the far right, which has been, putting out a lot of misinformation about vaccines and use the mandate as an excuse, a libertarian argument to push their illiberal agenda. And the fact is, as the mandates have been implemented, I've tracked the numbers here in New York. Healthcare workers, teachers, public employees, over 99% get the vaccine mandate, and the unions want more public health measures for their people. I was reading this week, they met with Biden and urged him to do more. That was the AFL-CIO and some of the big unions affiliated with it. It has not been the issue of any strike. So I know the argument is it's anti-worker, but what about your fellow workers? You don't have the right to come in and make them sick. So, yeah, I think Richard is wrong on that one. Waiting for another question. Cincy, do you think the DPRK, in other words, North Korea, is over demonized? I think it's hard to over demonize North Korea. It's a very repressive country. I think the question we need to consider is U.S. policy in relating to North Korea making it worse than it needs to be? And I think the answer to that is yes. We do, since Bush put them in the axis of evil, and we took out Saddam Hussein and we took out Muammar Gaddafi, it's understandable, it's rational for North Korea to get a nuclear weapon as a deterrent. And, we just got to understand that. Now, I don't like to see nuclear proliferation, but you also got to put yourselves in the shoes of the other side and see what they're concerned about. So what do they want? One thing they want is an end to the war, back from the 50s. There was an armistice, but not a peace treaty. Let's do a peace treaty. And, provide that each side agrees not to be aggressive toward the other. I think we can offer economic aid in return for demilitarization. They need the economic aid. In some cases, we should just provide the humanitarian aid for humanitarian reasons because people are hungry. We don't have a good idea how COVID has behaved in North Korea. I mean, the government says nobody got sick or very few got sick, but public health experts don't believe that. So, and I think we should, push for mutual demilitarization of the Korean Peninsula. And, then we need to work with the president of South Korea, Mr. Moon, who wants a better relationship with North Korea without accepting, their repressive, form of government. So right now we use, North Korea is kind of this demon to whip up militarism and this Cold War hysteria, and that's not productive. So I think there are constructive negotiations that could be had, and the U.S. should pursue those. But, I don't think there's much positive to say about, North Korea's form of government. It's, it's a one-party, very dictatorial state. And if you don't agree with, Mr. Kim, you're in trouble. You can't disagree. It's not a right you have. See, there are a number of questions. I'm just waiting for one to pop up. Whoop, I hit the wrong button. There I am. Well, here's a question I see on there. I'll answer. Vicky Gordon, how the Green Party will deal, how should it deal with Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Syria? Okay, the man behind the curtain saw the same one. Well, I think we need to lift sanctions on all those countries because it's hurting the people more than the leadership we might have disagreements with. So Cuba, we've been blockading them for what now, 60 years almost? 1962 to 60 years. With the stated objective for them to liberalize their political system. They haven't. Instead, they've used sanctions, along with other things we did, particularly in the earlier years of this. We tried to assassinate Castro, I don't know how many times. We invaded them at the Bay of Pigs. We threatened to annihilate them during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was, so they use that to justify, the one-party state and repression against political dissidents. So how about we lift the sanctions, establish commercial relations, have cultural exchanges. I think that might be a better approach. Same thing with Venezuela. They, people don't realize this, but not only did they disqualify some candidates on the right, they disqualified all the candidates pretty much to their left. The Popular Revolutionary Alliance, which ran on the Communist Party line because it's the only one that had ballot access, they arbitrarily eliminated a lot of those candidates for mayor and governorship and city councils across Venezuela in this last election. And, that's repressive. And we could go through a whole lot of things, from Hugo Chavez ruling by, what do you call it, mandate, or they just let him by executive decree, basically. Now, that was voted for by the democratically elected assembly, but that's not a very democratic way to change laws. And then after they lost the assembly election in 2015, they basically set up another one under their control. So there's a lot to criticize in Venezuelan democracy, but hell, there's a lot to criticize in countries all over the world. Why are we picking on Venezuela? Why are we pushing this guy, Juan Guaido, who hardly has any support, to be their president? So we got to stop that. Lift the sanctions, let Venezuela take care of its own problems. And, we can speak out against violation of democratic norms, but we need to fix them here in this country, from the Senate and the Electoral College to the, single-member district winner-take-all system. We're hardly the country to talk about democracy, as some of these international monetary agencies are beginning to believe. The United States has dropped, particularly with the authoritarian, coup attempt by the Trump people, and then the voter suppression laws that are passing. So we can criticize Venezuela, but as a country, it doesn't have much credibility given what we're doing in our own country. Iran, it's the people hurting from these sanctions. The leadership's fine. In fact, they're being challenged right now by a wave of strikes in the auto industry, and some others. And that's a much more semi-open political system because the opposition forces are pretty strong. They lost the last election. The guy that's now the president was actually the guy that led the execution of 30 or 40,000 leftists about 1983 or 4, when Ayatollah Khomeini had consolidated his power, and the clerical leadership, they just got rid of the left. They grabbed everybody they could and killed them. And that guy's now the president. He was elected. He's a hardliner. But sanctions against Iran just strengthens the hardliners. I think that's true in the, saber rattling we're doing toward Russia and China. That just gives them an excuse to crack down at home. They say the U.S. is meddling. So, I think we need a very different approach. And Syria, same thing. That country's flat on its back. We should, first of all, be providing humanitarian support to the refugees. Half the country is displaced. About a third of it is displaced overseas. And I don't think we should be militarily involved, supporting the militias that are mostly now Salafi or Islamic fundamentalists fighting Assad. We shouldn't be and in fact, I think we pulled out. Trump did that. As far as I know, there's been no documentation that we're still providing arms to those forces. We are in northeastern Syria, having supported the Kurds and allies who are Arabs and other ethnic groups to fight ISIS, which, Assad, the Russians, everybody want ISIS out of there. And Kurds did the bulk of the fighting. And we still have 900 troops over there supporting the Kurds on that. But they also have captured the oil fields and are using that as a revenue source for the Kurds. And that's Syrian oil. That should be negotiated. The U.S. has not participated in diplomatic negotiations that Russia, Iran, Turkey, and Syria have had. And they should get involved in that and try to come to some political solution, because, the destruction goes on, and, Assad gets control of an area, but now he's focused on Idlib, and he's got resistance popping up in other parts of the country where he reduced his forces. There needs to be a political solution, or this thing's going to drag on like Lebanon did It's been what now? 11, it's been 12 years. Lebanon took 15 years before they came to a settlement. Hopefully this will end sooner. So anyway, those are my thoughts and what I think the Green Party, how they should relate to those countries you named. So Guillermo Elena says, I'm whitewashing Al-Qaeda in Idlib. Brother, you didn't listen to what I said. I said we shouldn't be supporting them. So just to be clear on that. Okay, well, it's been an hour. I took a little longer in the opening, but we normally wrap up now. So I'll just reiterate what I said at the beginning. Happy New Year. I hope you're recharged from the holidays and ready to go to work. The kind of things that need to be raised at the federal level, it's not happening. The Democrats are rolling over for the Republicans. Their authoritarian moves on voter suppression and taking over election administration and certification. They won't lift the filibuster for voting rights, election protection, abortion rights. There's a whole lot they could do. There are, a score of progressive reforms the Democrats passed in the House but can't get through the Senate because of the filibuster. So we can't rely on the Democrats to deal with the issue of democracy, climate, economic justice. So I hope everybody's ready to get to work, and we'll be here next week, and I hope we'll see you then again. So have a good week.